Thank you, Mary. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rebecca Peabody, Head of Research Projects and Academic Outreach here at the Getty Research Institute, and one of the organizers of today's event. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Getty Graduate Symposium, and it's great to see so many people in the audience. I am additionally grateful for the reach offered by technology and want to take a moment to welcome our virtual audience as well. By way of orientation, we have around 150 people who have signed up to join us via Zoom today. Remote participants are joining us from across the United States, with concentrations in California and Oregon, the Midwest and New England, Washington, D.C., Georgia, and Texas. We also have registrants from Italy, Brazil, and the United Kingdom. We will have an opportunity for all of our audiences, in person and on Zoom, to be in conversation with each other and with the speakers during our discussion sessions, when we will be welcoming conversation and questions across the platforms. This symposium is the result of a series of collaborations that started several years ago when we reached out to the chairs of departments at each of the 9 schools represented here today and asked if they would join us in putting together an event to showcase the work of emerging scholars from research universities across California. Each year, each of our 9 partner institutions nominates a graduate student along with a faculty advisor to represent some of the best emerging scholarship from their department and their school. The Getty Graduate Symposium is an important event for us as it allows us to deepen our commitment to graduate education by showcasing and supporting the work of our emerging scholars, by providing a stage and a stepping stone in their professional careers, by connecting with art history departments across the state, and by contributing to the scholarly community that does so much to sustain us all. One of our core values when we put this event together is to create a supportive environment for our emerging scholars. We count on them to push the field in new and dynamic directions, and we both recognize and value the vision that takes and the dynamism and growth that it brings. Over the years, we've added an exciting new component to the event in the form of a pre-symposium workshop called How to Conference, aimed at undergraduates and master's level students in art history and curatorial studies who are learning how to engage with professional academic events. We've also added a hands-on opportunity for undergraduate and master's level students to engage with archives and special collections, and learn about the ways in which they are acquired and go on to become part of research projects, publications, and exhibitions. Academic outreach at the GRI serves academic communities through professionalization-related events like these, as well as resources, training, programs, workshops, and internships for scholars. If you'd like to receive news, announcements, and other updates from us, please take a moment to sign up for our email list in the lobby outside. And please also take a flyer, which will point via QR codes to some of the GRI scholarly resources, such as fellowships, library resources, news, and employment opportunities. Many thanks are always in order, as this is truly a group effort. Specifically, I would like to thank each of our partner institutions who are indicated on the program, along with the administrative staff within individual departments who help us organize our annual call for nominations, our speakers and their advisors, the participants in our workshop earlier this week, in particular students from the Atlanta University Center Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective who have traveled to be here with us today, as well as students from our local Cal State universities. And last but definitely not least, our audience. Thanks as well to the GRI for its continued support, Kristen Juarez, Brisa Smith-Flores, and Sue Kang for their expertise and leadership in our workshops, Peyton Phillips-Quintanilla for her help with grouping the abstracts, and William Ramirez, Sue Kang, Chelsea Anderson, Lauren Artis, Adrian Cesares, and our great AV team who do so much behind the scenes to make sure everything runs smoothly. A couple of notes about our program today. We will have 3 sessions made up of 3 speakers each. Within each session, we will move through the presentations without breaking for individual questions, but we have reserved time at the end of each session for a discussion of the papers, as well as questions from the audience. For our live streaming audience, as questions occur to you, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can do this at any time. There's no need to wait until the discussion to submit questions. We will do our best to include those in the Q&A session. And last but not least, if you haven't already, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I would now like to welcome our first speaker, Nastasya Kosygina, who will be introduced by Matthew Canepa, both of who are joining us from the University of California, Irvine. Welcome to Nastasya and Matthew.
Right. Thank you for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. So with a background in art history, classical studies, and chemistry, Nastasya Kosygina is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History and PhD program in Visual Studies at University of California, Irvine. Nastasya's dissertation is entitled Palimpsestuous Urbanism, Infrastructure and the Watery Underwriting of Late Antique Rome. This dissertation addresses geology, urban planning, and representation of water in the city of Rome during the late imperial and early medieval periods. In her research, she is interested in the lived experience of marginalized and subaltern individuals and communities, the impoverished, the unhoused, and the enslaved, who had intimate firsthand knowledge of the landscape of volcanic ash and water from and upon which the city of Rome is constructed. Nastasya is also the organizer of an upcoming interdisciplinary conference to be held at UCI titled In the Borough, Critical Approaches to Infrastructure, which explores this subject with early career scholars and colleagues across the humanities. So this will take place March 8th and 9th if anybody is interested. So without further ado, Nastasya.
Good morning. Beginning a Roman Studies talk by riffing off of, thank you. Good morning. Beginning a Roman Studies talk by riffing off of René Magritte's The Treachery of Images is rather loud, but germane to a larger set of thoughts I have about the relationship between text, image, and matter in the late antique Mediterranean. Today, I will briefly navigate us through the public subterranean infrastructures in the city of Rome to describe how maintenance workers and entertainers, as subaltern, often enslaved subjects, experienced the Roman body politic through both real and imagined encounters rooted in their own bodies. I will interrogate the subject positions of the various individuals involved in the production of a 4th century curse tablet found in the city of Rome, just outside the ancient walls. I excavate the urban logics and spaces that this inscribed lead tablet relies upon to effect the malicious binding upon a charioteer, waiting in the wings in the carcer of a nearby circus in anticipation of the important race. I implicate lead water pipes, along with disused burial sites, and imperial latrines in public baths, as well as Rome's urban Grecophone migrant classes in the very middle-class interest of such curses. This paper exhumes the power relations embedded in the control and manipulation of water in the late Roman Empire from below, focusing on maintenance spaces which subtended public infrastructure and were accessible primarily to the enslaved worker and performer. It argues that such spaces as liminal zones subsumed in Rome's urban environment furnished the raw material for negotiating and extending personal agency beyond an individual's own embodied, classed capacity to act upon the world. Along with construction laborers, public slaves, individuals enslaved to the city, rather than to a specific household, who were employed as maintenance workers on urban infrastructure, were sensitized to the materiality of the urban environment in ways that reflected back on their own perception of their agency and place in the world. Public slaves were tasked with entering the subterranean tracts of aqueducts, like the underground stretch of the Aqua Marcia pictured here, and scraping mineralized accretions from their arterial walls. They were responsible for the maintenance of drains that ran beneath the city, traversing special walkways inside the channels, collecting the floodwaters and wastewaters, which endangered Rome's urban rhythms. Such individuals had the endoscopic perspective on the urban body. They worked as the gut flora of the city's underbelly, functioning in time with the rhythms of the landscape above and reflecting, portending, and impacting the body politic. So, how could a plumber with a section of lead piping get a charioteer in hot water at the Roman circus races? At the turn of the 4th century CE, the plumber, likely a public slave, could do the charioteer dirty by providing a length of pipe formerly used for distributing cold water to a workshop of malicious magic practitioners. Our maintenance worker, here a plumber in the traditional sense of dealing in plumum, lead pipe, could make a small sum from the side heist and think no more on this matter. To follow the progress of this pipe and its transformation from water conduit to a conduit of malignant forces, we'll move on an axis stretching from one of the oldest public hubs of activity in Rome, the Circus Maximus, to the Circus of Maxentius, newly built in the 4th century in the middle of the burial grounds belonging to the city. A disused columbarium, an underground Roman funerary space, just outside the city walls, and the baths of Caracalla, the largest and most important baths in the city at this time, mark the other 2 key points on our route. Our plumber would have furtively twisted the lead pipe from the end of a water line, or else harvested it from a decommissioned length of lead during its replacement by a maintenance crew. Funded by a wealthy client interested in affecting the outcome of the chariot races at either the Circus Maximus or the Circus of Maxentius, the plumber would have procured this lead at the behest of a workshop of cursed tablet makers, where a scribe then assiduously flattened and hammered the lead into an irregularly shaped, thin sheet no larger than a human palm, and incised it using a sharp metal stylus or a nail with line-drawn images and Greek text. The pipe, now ostensibly refitted into a tool of violence, was then rolled up, pierced with an iron nail, and sent off, likely with another enslaved worker, down the Appian Way, Rome's oldest road, just past one of the southern gates, the Porta San Sebastiano, to a disused burial site. There, at a columbarium, a sort of Roman underground mini parking garage for human remains, like this one here, the runner would clandestinely enter and place the curse inside of one of the ossuaries ensconced within. Ossuaries are small, often rectangular containers traditionally used by Romans for the reburial of cremated remains, by the by. So all this was for the purpose of making certain that a charioteer by the name of Cardellos, son of Fulgentia, would lose at the races. Given his occupation, Cardellos was likely enslaved or libertus, an ex-slave himself. Charioteers and other entertainment workers, famously gladiators, often began their short and brutal careers enslaved and, if they were fortunate, survived and succeeded enough to become celebrities and buy out their freedom. The plumber, providing the tablet makers with the raw material, was likely also enslaved, along with several intermediaries implicated in the delivery of the curse. On the other hand, the client who ordered the curse was ostensibly a moderately wealthy individual, invested enough in the social and financial game of the circus races to be prepared to pay for such an object. But he was unlikely to have much information about or access to Rome's aquatic underbelly himself. The shared and varying levels of access, both physical and conceptual, to Rome's infrastructure conspire in the subversive agency of this cursed tablet. The transgressive, grave, disturbing final resting place of the object, and its equally covert origins as a wayward piece of urban water infrastructure collaborate to incapacitate Cardellos the charioteer. At the time of excavation, the cursed tablet cache numbered 56 lead scrolls across several ossuaries at the columbarium site. The Via Appia San Sebastiano curse tablets were excavated in 1850 from, quote, a very ruined tomb, except in a few parts, such as a mosaic representing a woman with a child, thought by the excavators to have been either the Virgin Mary and child or Isis and Horus. The dating is frankly too early for an image of Mary to appear in Rome, since the columbarium is like 2nd to 3rd century. So an image of Isis and Horus Harpocrates, similar to this 4th century painting from Roman Egypt, seems more plausible. And incidentally, Isis is thought to have been one of the late antique visual prototypes for Mary, so the excavator's misidentification has actually some historical precedent. But sadly, we don't have the mosaic from Rome. But the archaeological excavation also yielded a perfectly preserved sarcophagus along with several small sarcophagi, presumably ossuaries, some in marble, others in terracotta, containing a certain quantity of lead sheets all rolled up. And we have the curse tablets because, unlike the rest of the material from this site, or the columbarium itself, the lead sheets were removed from the terracotta sarcophagi and transported them to the Ministry of Public Works and Antiquities. So what is notable about this sparse account is the possible presence of an Egyptianizing image of Isis and Horus in this columbarium. As I'll shortly demonstrate, this might explain the curse maker's choice to break into this particular funerary space to deposit their cursed tablets. Now, given the small number of finds listed in the report and the presence of a mosaic, this specific burial site may have been a smaller, fancier, cult-associated columbarium, perhaps resembling this nearby columbarium of Pomponius Hylas pictured here. So the 56 chariot racing-related lead curse tablets, written largely in Greek and found near the Porta San Sebastiano, strongly participate in the widespread Grecophone curse tablet tradition, echoing and recombining formulae familiar from diverse parts of the Mediterranean. However, the Via Appia curse tablets, the few of which were recovered, unfurled, and translated, also innovate upon this widely shared archive, not only recombining and inverting Norn formulae to predatorily circle around the surface of the object, but imbuing these constructions with new local meaning that draws authority from Rome's uniquely urban environment, particularly its infrastructure. Uniquely in the curse inscription, the scribe tasked with cursing Cardellos identifies the curse tablet as a cold water pipe in Greek, a petalopsuchrophoro, twice. Despite the immense amount of visual information squeezed onto this tiny lead surface, the tablet's authors insist on its coldness and pipeness. Furthermore, they deployed this turn of phrase in a city redolent with power relations, embedded in and communicated through water infrastructure. Think aqueducts and baths are some of the first things we think about when we think about Rome to this day. The text of the curse navigates around the image of a frontal figure, half risen from a rectangular form, perhaps an emperor's or judge's box at the circus races. The inscription likewise shies away from the incised image of an animal-headed, cloven-footed anthropomorphic figure, which surmounts a cross-hatched ovoid form resembling a tipped-over statue or mummy encircled by two serpents. Repeated Greek letters, evoking prolonged vocalization rather than semantic meaning, appear alongside the anthropomorphic equine figure, which above its head we find a string of caracteres, linear symbols associated with magical scribal practice. The text formulaically invokes and reiterates ill will upon Cardellos' body. The tablet invokes various feminine and chthonic supernatural forces to, quote, bind down and restrain, bind down hand and foot, bind down and give to the one beneath the earth, Cardellos' body. The curse inscription punctuates these chthonic invocations with a weighty repetition of the Greek prefix kata, literally down, also used in Greek as an intensifier, down and harder, so to speak. Objects made in this tradition are called katadesmoi for the frequent and genre-defining occurrence of the Greek verb for binding, katadein. Thus, the repetition, make very cold, katapsuchrenete, explicitly presses down on Cardellos' bodily agency, rendering him immobile. As it is dragged downwards with increasing metaphysical force, Cardellos' body is chilled and liquefied, melted down more and more. The cursed tablet transmogrifies its target by transmuting his materiality, depriving him of the somatic agency which the curse's text so vividly describes. It calls to, quote, make cold, make very cold, melt down again, make wither, make waste away, melt down again, the being and the life and the bones and the marrow and the sinews and the flesh and the power of Cardellos once, and then again, together bind down and bind hand and foot and work together and chill the strength of the marrow, the sinews, the flesh, and the power in his prime of life. The immobilizing and deforming, cold and watery language of binding, subsuming, melting, and freezing employed by the curse is aggressively somatized. Hands and feet, strength, marrow, sinews, flesh, power, visible and invisible, tangible and intangible affordances of the body are enumerated as they are subdued. I believe that the text of this curse borrows from and improvises upon a specific subset of formulae which are packaged together, in which one 4th century Egyptian papyrus, known as PGM7, parallels most strongly. The various magical instructions in this papyrus compendium, mostly in Greek, some in Demotic Egyptian, provide instructions for, among other things, a spell for silencing, subjecting, and restraining, which suggests taking a lead from a cold water pipe, inscribing it with a set of caracteres and names illustrated on the papyrus, and then finishing off with the command to restrain, katasche, and add the usual as you wish. The Roman curse scribe took this seasoned-to-taste instruction at its word, and concocted a truly chimeric curse, mixing in a dash of a restraining curse right for everything, which works even on chariots, and which also features incising lead from a cold water channel and combining this object with a very loose and flexible set of water-laden, chronically charged environmental materials, river mud near a stream or the drain of a bath, sometimes also the sea. This soggy setting, coupled with an invocation of the dead Egyptian god Osiris, could be used to prolong the desired effect of the spell as long as one wished. But if the thread-tied charm is buried or sunk in a river or sea or stream or coffin, its effect could be made permanent when coupled instead with an Orphic formula, which is a Greek mystical chthonic incantational tradition. The watery associations and flexibility of these instructions, coupled with marriage of Greek and Egyptian menu options, may have appealed to the Roman curse scribe. This bundle of formulae borrows from a mixed Greco-Egyptian cultural context, which by the 4th century would have been both exotic and familiar to Roman audiences. The animal-headed central figure we saw on the tablet cursing Cardellos may have been borrowed from the illustration accompanying this fragmentary Demotic Egyptian charm, also from PGM7, intended to induce lust in a female subject. This charm invokes the god Anubis and references a mummy, which the accompanying image echoes. Our Greek-writing scribe living in Italy, however, may not have recognized or cared to recognize jackal-headed Anubis preparing the mummy for burial from the Egyptian context, but may have simply borrowed the imagery. Nevertheless, looking at this cursed tablet's resonance with a 4th century Greco-Egyptian compendium, we can see that associating this group of cursed tablets with a funerary mosaic of Isis and Horus would have been attractive to the curse makers, since they were already operating in an Egyptian-flavored milieu. Note the hole in the unrolled tablet. I mentioned earlier that in this tradition, and according to the archaeological report for this particular set of objects, many of the cursed tablets were pierced with nails like finger foods on toothpicks at a cocktail party. We don't have the accompanying nail for this particular cursed tablet, but if it followed the trend, the hole in the tablet's body would pass directly through the head and the heart of the snake-bound mummy-like effigy at the animal-headed figure's feet. This then is Cardellos, the target charioteer, and thus the curse negotiates his binding both on the surface of the tablet and through it, beyond the object's confines. In effecting this curse, the watery coldness of the pipe pierces through Rome's aquatic infrastructural underbelly, adopting the coldness of supernatural, otherworldly water, a liminal charge and potential already inherent in the subterranean mythology and uses of Rome's urban waterways. The curse pipe, incised with the language of binding, subordinates the charioteer by purporting to drag his frozen yet liquid body into and beyond the ground, crossing both physical and supernatural thresholds. Just as the subterranean route of Rome's oldest drain and founding monument, the Cloaca Maxima, was accompanied at crossing points on the surface by Janus bridges and other more enduring monuments associated with the god of thresholds, seasonal change, and liminality, so was the cursed tablet's past as a subterranean cold water conduit attendant upon Cardellos' future misfortune. The deformed lead of this cold water pipe contributes a watery valence to the curse, its material in negotiating Cardellos' premature threshold crossing into death. And the transgressive reuse of the columbarium to house this cursed tablet sets up an additional formal rhyme through the city's very topography that parallels and exceeds the workings of the images and text on the curse. The placement of the tablet within the columbarium leeches off of the deathly potency of human remains contained at the site, yet also establishes a microcosmic parallel between the location of the charioteer and the location of the tablet. Now, the most ideal place to put a tablet like this one is in the floor of a circus carcer, a niched enclosed space in the wings of a circus grounds outside the public eye, where the charioteer would await the beginning of the race. The carcer, accessible primarily to the enslaved entertainer and far more difficult to penetrate and so, with concealed magic objects, formally echoes the enclosed niched space of a columbarium. Thus, the cursed tablet embodying and affecting Cardellos' fate by representing it in miniature also resides within a miniaturized, chtonically charged analog to the circus carcer. The rolled-up lead tube, in addition to playing a pipe, takes on the role of a miniature scroll and underworld messenger that, crossing the threshold between a permeable, disused burial space and a restricted infrastructural interstice, heralds Cardellos' demise. The columbarium chosen by the curse tablet workshop lies between the Circus Maximus, which is like 2 kilometers, 30 minutes walking, and the Circus of Maxentius, 4 kilometers outside the city walls. The Circus of Maxentius is itself a funerary monument newly built by the emperor during the beginning of the 4th century for his prematurely deceased son. The Baths of Caracalla, halfway along the route from the Circus Maximus to the columbarium, would have been, if not the source of the lead pipe, then a crucial topographic reference that reinforced the pipeness and wateriness of the lead. Redolent with imperial imagery and suffused with water, the baths provided conceptual, if not literal, fodder for the curse's desire to appropriate and augment the pipe's capacity to channel power by channeling water. Serendipitously for cursing a charioteer with a water pipe, the Baths of Caracalla appear to have contained at least one monumental latrine shaped like a chariot, now held in the British Museum. Unlike the standard and symmetrically arrayed series of latrines equipped to the baths, this unique object may have been reserved for the imperial person on the occasion that the emperor would visit the baths and require some, chthonic relief for his own infrastructure. Notably, it's made of the veined Pavonazzetto marble, which we otherwise encounter at the Baths of Caracalla as decorative wall facing and decorative columns. This latrine is made out of marble, typically used to ornament and aesthetic. And although no archaeological evidence remains of its exact location in the baths, this chariot-shaped latrine, as nevertheless a functional latrine, would, like all latrines, have surmounted a channel of flowing water. When designing the curse, the magic workshop using the Via Appia columbarium benefited from its proximity to an imperial bath complex. It's about 15 minutes walking, by the way, like 15, very close by. Equipped with a chariot-shaped latrine, and laden with subterranean watery associations at a monumental level. The Baths of Caracalla, with their above-ground monumental ornamental spectacle of the chariot latrine and the above-board social and political spectacle of the circus races, represent the world of the affluent client who commissioned the cursed tablet. But this above-ground world was serviced and subtended by subaltern enslaved knowledges and bodies who had privileged access to the city's underground, watery, interstitial maintenance spaces. The amount of enslaved labor and maintenance work required to operate the baths for just 4 hours a day when they were open, from lugging the 10 tons of wood needed to heat the waters of the caldarium and tepidarium, to managing the cart-wide tunnels beneath the baths which furnished access to the supply wagons, to navigating the narrow maintenance walkways within the bathhouse walls, implicated a multitude of subaltern bodies in the smooth running of the baths at all times. The curse tablet workshop mobilized these subaltern knowledges and bodies in order to acquire the raw materials for the curse pipe, to clandestinely deposit the object into the funerary resting place, all in order to force an outcome that would be visible in the above-ground spectacle of the circus races and perceptible to the client of the curse tablet. Thus, the enslaved body of the plumber holding one end of the pipe and the enslaved charioteer's experience of its metaphysical blows on the other side share an expanded yet visceral and material relationship to pipeness through the guts of the city. The plumber and the charioteer share an enslaved subject position and access to the interstitial spaces in Rome's public infrastructure, the watery subterranean maintenance tunnel and the carcer. The pipe they stand on either side of acquires agency as a contract, a scroll, a curse object, and a performative microcosm, but remains, for its enslaved subjects, a cold water pipe. For the plumber and the charioteer both, the pipe is metonymic of the precarity of their labor. It stands in for a network of material relations in which they are both prized and marginalized for their access to the interstitial spaces secluded in Roman public infrastructure. Only the maintenance worker gets to walk between the bath walls and contact the heating and water distribution systems of the city from within. Only the public slave charged with digging or maintaining Rome's largely subterranean aqueduct channels knows where the wall sections bend and don't quite meet below the surface, or what it looks, feels, and smells like to scrape mineralized accretions from their inner walls. To the plumber, the pipe is a tube of lead to be maintained or excised from the urban body. To the charioteer, this pipe is either just a pipe and the curse fails, or as per the will of the curse's higher status client who has money riding on a rival charioteer's hip, the curse tablet has a metaphysical materiality of cold water pipes, and therefore all the malicious affordances of Greco-Roman, Greco-Egyptian, Mediterranean chthonic magic. As far as everyone is concerned, this pipe is a treacherous object. Thank you.
I start first with thanks to the Getty Research Institute. I start with thanks to the Getty Research Institute and for this incredible opportunity to present, for students to present, graduate students to present their work. My job right now is to introduce Maria Shevelkina. She came to medieval through modern art. She worked as an archive assistant at the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation. Slightly before that time, she interned at the Feropontov Monastery in the Russian north and was mesmerized by medieval art. This spurred her to pursue a master's degree with the renowned medievalist Cynthia Hahn at Hunter College. This thesis is a masterwork that explores sacred space, how it is constructed through light and color, the Feropontov Monastery. The 16th-century frescoes and their recent restoration had revealed a second technique that layers pigment with transparent glazes, creating a reflective, gem-like surface, reflective and luminous, filling the space with light. It is this ambience that attracts Maria's eyes and mind. This research is now a publication, Transparency, Color, and Light in the Feropontov Monastery's Nativity of the Mother of God Church, in the edited volume, Natural Light in Medieval Churches. It is this essay that inaugurated Maria's admission to Stanford University. Since she joined the program as a brilliant young scholar, she has been involved in all aspects of the academic program, producing strong research papers, presenting these ideas at conferences, including CAA, Bissera, and the Society of Architectural Historians, on topics ranging from Byzantine miniature painting to the perception of light in the mosque at Cordova. She is also the initiator and co-founder of the Stanford Global Studies Approaches to Sacred Space. It is a workshop that we run 3 times in a quarter and brings scholars from all over the world. Maria's PhD goal was to work on Russian medieval art, but already in her first year of graduate school, the war in Ukraine broke out, and this denied possibilities for this intellectual and research trajectory. Maria joined Professor Osterhut's summer study program in Cappadocia in her first summer, where she discovered a new realm. The Grape Church, or Uzumluki Lycée, is what you're going to hear today. It is a study that recognizes the importance of ornament, treating geometric and vegetal motifs as equal into the anthropomorphic figure. The paradoxical incarnation of Christ sanctifies all matter, so stone and pigment mix with spirit and light, and the aniconic grapevine rinceau reinforces or reifies the form of the vessel containing the uncontainable. Now please welcome Maria Shevelkina.
Thank you so much, Bissera, for that generous introduction. And also thank you to the Getty, to Mary, to Rebecca, and especially to William for having me here. I'm very excited to share my work. Okay. Ooh, sorry. Here we go. This is one of an infinite number of views across the Rose Valley of Cappadocia in Asia Minor, or Anatolia. Tucked between the vast grassy plateaus are ochre valleys whose tough limestone, ash, and basalt have melted and formed through millennia of volcanic activity. Soft and jagged rock formations are skirted with wild but once cultivated trees, bushes, vines, and brambles. Thank you. Beginning in at least the 4th century, Byzantine Christians across social strata, hermits, monks, army officials, land peasants, carved their sacred spaces into these rocks. Hundreds of such Rupestrian sites were constructed in the area across the centuries, often alongside areas for daily living. These fascinating and diverse structures are beautifully detailed in the late Robert Ousterhout's 2017 monumental book Visualizing Community, as well as many other scholarly works going back to Guillaume de Gerfagnon's 1925 multi-volume L'Église rupestre de Cappadoce. Decades of excavations have revealed that many rock-cut churches from the 6th to at least the 13th centuries are painted in a wide range of motifs and narratives, borrowing iconographies from programs developed in Rome, Constantinople, and Palestine, and extending imagery used by the diverse cultures of the Mediterranean regions. Despite their avowed appropriations of cosmopolitan late antiquity, the rock-cut churches of Cappadocia fashioned their own regional and individual approaches to the production, meaning, and function of the art and architecture of sacred space. What kind of artistic relations with the divine were formed from within the physical depths of the Cappadocian heartland? How did constructions and wall paintings reflect on their natural surroundings? I hope to offer a possible answer to these questions by analyzing the formal aesthetics of one such church from an early grouping of plaster-painted sites dating to around the 9th century. As this group of churches falls immediately after the end of the second wave of Byzantine iconoclasm, it is inevitably marked by the preceding era's wave of image-based controversy. The sites offer an alternative to the modern scholarly interpretation in which figuration triumphs as the natural progression out from iconophobia. Instead, there's evidence that the figural and non-figural were seamlessly and equivalently blended to one another as methods of rendering the divine. While my presentation remains dedicated to a single monument, it points to aspects of abstraction, namely ornament, that are often overlooked in the pursuit of grasping the mechanisms of image and space. Here in this talk, as well as in my art historical and theoretical studies overall, I am most interested in pursuing the paradox behind the physical materialization of invisible forms. A single conical formation stands slightly apart from the fleshy volcanic Cappadocian cliffs. Circumambulating around the structure's base reveals a diminutive, semicircular archway carved into the rock, marking an unimposing entry into the early 9th century church of Niketas, a name referencing the hermit who once lived there. The church is also toponymically known as Uzumluki Lycée, Grape Church, which is the name I will use throughout this presentation, preserving the crucial connection to nature. Beyond the threshold is a vibrant array of paintings that once covered the minuscule carved chapel from floor to ceiling. The space we experience today has transformed mostly by enlargements to its dimensions through further carving over centuries of use, as well as natural deterioration. By sculpting the church space directly into the pre-existent rock, the structure is explicitly within the land. The paintings further integrate the space into the physical through the activation of abstracting forms. Arches, vaults, and a floating dome spring barely 2 meters from the ground. The claustrophobic space alludes to the idea of a single aisle masonry church. Through both exaggeration and abstraction, the physical is stimulated into being. Light is rendered in the form of pigmented color, and architectonics are rendered in the form of carved living rock. The shallow barrel vault ceiling of Uzumlu Kilise's vestibule features a narrowly framed image of tender red ochre shoots interpenetrating one another, closely enveloping a geometric cross of alternating rhombi and squares at center. As the space physically nearest to the outer landscape, the vestibule painting is a blurred transition, softly easing into the consecrated area by introducing the geometric iconic cross symbol through a plane of vegetation. Such entwinement is intensified in the church's nave, the next successive chamber as the space deepens into the rock. Here, the slightly longer and wider vault makes way for a similarly embellished fertile cross. Husky vines burst open with ripened red fruit on a background shining with golden light. A thick band of interlaced medallions, each with cross at center, turn around the frame on a dotted background. Their serpentine coils connect to each other to the outer edge of the painted frame and to the inner frame, creating a passepartout for the central image. These emblematic explicit coils are the connective nerves, situated neither here nor there, one circle correlated to each saint depicted directly below. At Uzumlu Kilise, the prominent ornamental interlace makes the dynamic frame, mitigating between the natural and the theological. The coiling ornaments also point to the fluid structure of the space, where the upper vault is carved in a smooth parabola toward the ground in a manner difficult, if not impossible, to construct by masonry. Budding crosses, now almost fully deteriorated from the rubbing of bodies and furniture due to their low positioning on the side walls, proliferate throughout the nave beneath each architraved apostle. Their stylized forms are exaggerated versions of the 2 ceiling crosses, and their positions mediate between liturgical participants and the intercessory figures depicted above. The 12 imposing apostles, 6 on each side, are squeezed between thin arcades, dressed in luxurious fabrics of white and gold, situated in front of a deep orange background. Each apostle gesticulates in blessing toward the conglomerate scene on the eastern tympanum, where the central crucifixion is set along Simeon the Stylite and John the Baptist. 4 saints of poverty, sumptuously clad in thick robes, respond from the facing western arch. All of these figures, their histories originating in completely different temporalities, are brought together into the small claustrophobic space where they address one another as well as the participant, beneath the infinite aegis of the ever-flowering, ever-fruiting ornament hovering just above. Mary, the Christian Theotokos, meaning bearer or birther of God, takes a prevalent yet vague form at Uzumlu Kilise. She is figured in her heavenly enthronement in the domical apse in the farthest depth of the church. Yet her essence is also rendered by tender shoots before the nave. She is prophesied by symbols of royal lineage. She mourns at the crucifixion, and she is the blossoming fruit of the centrally rendered cross. She is the connective transmorphic tissue across spaces and times. As the late 7th century homilist and hymnographer Andrew of Crete points out in a homily on Mary's Dormition, quote, "She is the great world in miniature, the world containing him who brought the world from nothingness into being, that it might be the messenger of his own greatness," unquote. Through the Theotokos, the world is transmuted in scale and reconfigured in the miniature space, reiterating via extension all of existence within the singular church. In other words, Uzumlu Kilise exemplifies the well-known paradoxical epithet ascribed to the Theotokos since early Christianity. Both structure and symbolic figure are the, quote, containers of the uncontained, whether the uncontainable is divinity or nature. The physical actualities of Uzumlu Kilise described just now lead me to derive several broader ideas regarding the materialization of form in space, meaning various modes of artistic abstraction within the carved structure, which I'll now outline further. First, space, time, and structure are collapsed through art and architecture, allowing for processes of significations of nature and divinity to cycle in parallel. Second, amplifications, exaggerations, intermedial analogies, and non-figurative abstractions are used as methods for rendering the visible components of an ultimately invisible unknown. If forms make up the substance of how space, or any entity for that matter, functions, then the equalization of forms across boundaries, whether spatial, temporal, structural, symbolic, or referential, directly affects how the world is experienced. Things that may initially present as separate are, upon closer examination within the same realm, bound by the same forces. Ultimately, I show that this accepted singularity is in fact mystery, and this is not a mystery to be resolved, but a complete mystery to be received. I would like to consider how the invisible is made visible through structure and form, while upholding and even amplifying inherent enigma across superimposed bounds. In consequence, I have found that sacred spaces are not always marked by separation, as in the polytheistic Greek sacred temenos or temple, but rather may broach the division inherent in the cutting away of the sacred from the so-called common or profane use. I arrive at this version of sacred space through the mysteries intrinsic to visible forms, whether constituting nature, architecture, or painting. Neoplatonic worldviews defined truth as lying within the path of unknowing. Thus, the artistic elements I identify today mitigate between mimetic realism on one end and symbolic transcendentalism on the other. In the intermediate lies a realm that is either shadowy or dazzling, nebulous or hyperbolic, yet always consistent in facilitating mystery. In addition to the space itself, I rely on contemporaneous late antique Christian poetics. These texts verbally represent the paradigmatic shifts induced by Neoplatonism, in which the divine truth underlying the physical world is apprehended through aesthesis, induced by forms, and aimed at unknowing. Metaphors are consciously used as methods for nearing indescribable and invisible mystery. My aim in including these texts is to provide verbal illustration for the cultural pervasiveness of ineffability. Furthermore, many of these poetic sources would have been liturgically performed within these spaces. They are used here as constructs that help us understand the functionality of sensible forms. As the 5th century liturgist John Chrysostom says in his homily on the incomprehensibility of God, bringing together his own experiences of viewing art and nature, quote, "We wonder at the beauty of columns, mural art, and the physical beauty of youth, just as we wonder at the open sea and its limitless depth. But we wonder fearfully when we stoop down and see how deep it is," unquote. Chrysostom marks the beginning of a philosophical Neoplatonist inquiry into truth through thauma, wonder. Attempts at perceiving the visible inherently abut with mystery and always lead to some form of the unknown, inducing either awe or fear or both. The ornamental flowering cross motif at Uzumukilise, teeming with prolific life rooted deeply in its fecund soil, is a metonymical rendition of the Theotokos, her mysterious fertility rendered in the painting and refiguring the productive land of Cappadocia. The earth's bounty is offered and made imminent for all directly through the mystery of Mary's conception, as in the hymn on virginity by the 4th century St. Ephrem the Syrian, who addresses her in essence. In the hymn, perception passes through various material metonyms in which matter shares meaning with form. A gaze, like oil, flows in an olive tree that contains divine symbols, illuminating this arboreal, quote, treasure house with its light, that's capital L. The tree bears divine types in the form of fruits, materializing the immaterial. While the fruits and leaves are openly revealed, the symbols and types remain secretive. The hymn concludes that the olive treasury, quote, gives life to the body with its visible things and to the mind with its secrets, unquote. This complicated discourse is rife with terminology at the center of early Christian issues regarding representation. The invisible is made visible in the physical world through both explicit and mysterious symbols and types. At Uzumukilise, light is actualized by the brilliant gamut of ochre pigments sourced from the minerals of the immediate environment, their undiluted colors radiating from the walls. Light comes from the byproduct of nature, whether oil from the sacred olive tree, fruit from the flowering cross, or pigment from the living rock. As the Theotokos in the hymn, Uzumlu-Kilise both exudes a sacred light and contains the fruit of blossoming life, within which secretive symbols and types are simultaneously hidden and revealed by the flowering tree painted on the vaults. Through the rendering of form and color, the enigmatic nutrients of the holy are ripened for harvest. The hymn is situated in an agricultural world where the processes of creation and the powers of alimentation are physically experienced but cannot be fully perceived, occurring beneath the soil at the level of elemental interactions. Certain historical changes substantiate the inclusion of heavily ornamental imagery in the 9th century church. By the mid-8th century, the production of figural floor mosaics was largely abandoned, while a century earlier, the Quinisex Council of Trullo decreed that, quote, signs of the cross should not decorate the floor in order that the trophy of our victory may not be insulted by the trampling feet of those who walk upon it, unquote. The ornamental barrel vault at Uzumlu-Kilise adheres to both directives, transposing the cross along with its ornamental motifs from the floor mosaic decoration standard in late antiquity to the ceiling vault. In the widely known Akathistos hymn, dated to around the 6th century, several rhythmic songs of praise directed at the Theotokos are compelling in their similarity in form and content with the motifs at Uzumlu-Kilise. With its abundant allusions and express metaphors, the hymn is a pertinent example of a contemporaneous attempt to verbally express the invisible. The words never name or describe the Theotokos directly, but rather they consistently reference her as the living, breathing materialization of lived experience. The actualization of harvest and spiritual reaping by way of the Theotokos and her forms induces a list of epithets that blur the line between earth and divinity, and I will quote a few lines. Hail, vine twig of unfading bud, hail, treasure of undying fruit, hail you who till the tiller who loves mankind, hail you who cultivate the cultivator of life, hail earth that flourishes with the fertility of compassion, hail since you make the meadow of delights blossom again. While meant to praise the Theotokos, the hymn calls up non-mimetic dynamic forms in the listener's imagination. Instead of picturing the image of the Theotokos as human, the hymn magnifies the sacrality of the natural within her invisible womb, just as the luscious vines, fruiting cross, and twirling medallions are abstracted visual icons of the Theotokos formally rendered within the Rupestrian womb. Thus, the painted forms visually bridge conceptual and literal sustenance. These descriptive metonyms are offered through a myriad of mutated forms in saturated colors, tendrils, fruits, gems, and medallions. With the Theotokos, the natural world is exaggerated and abstracted into a sacred space carved from the rock, but not separated from it. The explicit inclusion of the natural in the sacred imagery dissipates demarcated boundaries. An abundant use of ornament further upholds this necessary induction of mystery as a vehicle of growth. In the case of Uzumlu-Kilise, as in many other late antique examples, ornament is form, object, marker of space, producer of movement, and visual metonym all at once. Inherently unapprehendable to its fullest extent through symbols or mimetics, ornament appears within an infinite crevice, the space between exponential curve and untouchable access. Ornament arrives ad infinitum as closely as possible to the unknown without negating form or matter. As a metonym subsumed by a referent whose form is never fully consummated, ornament indeed falls outside the boundaries of naturalized rationality, logic, and truth. Ornament reproduces the framework of discontinuity that structures perception. Ornament is the mediating staccato of blinking vision. Ornament breaks visibility as the inherent momentary darknesses of eyesight. For my purposes as an art historian and theorist, the mysteries facilitating nature, the Theotokos, and ornament can be used to better describe a type of pre-modern abstraction in which forms are recognized for and function in their ambiguous potential. With the acceptance of the elemental, if not atomic, commonality between nature and the divine, forms, colors, and structure are amplified and exaggerated to their greatest extent, allowing for infinite nearing access to the unknown. In a sense, I claim that those who created Uzumlu-Kilise were theorizing with natural physical materials, connecting form and meaning through abstraction. As the physicist-philosopher Karen Barad explains in their discussion of agential realism, quote, theorizing and experimenting are not about intervening from outside, but about interacting from within and as a part of the phenomena produced, unquote. As such, the forms of Uzumlu-Kilise's painting and architecture actively generate the space or phenomenon they inhabit. Structural components of the carved church itself are made productive and dynamic through the twisting ornament enlivening the walls. In another homily on the Theotokos by the 5th century Archbishop Proclus of Constantinople, amorphous space-time is described as the foundation for the creation of all things in unfathomable wisdom, which has no directionality, beginning, or end. Creative processes oscillate between heaven and earth, elemental and planetary. For Proclus, the Theotokos is the ultimate exemplification of creative wisdom as the, quote, created form that gave its form to the creator, unquote. Following this same pattern, the earth, teeming with the unseen powers of life, produces the forms that become, in turn, the substance of artistic production. The mystery of materialization further deepens the ultimate invisibility of creation, as the homily concludes, quote, if you are not able to understand the origin of man, why do you seek to know the incarnation of God, unquote. The listeners are exhorted not to waste their energies looking for that which cannot be perceived, whether it be the creation of God, images beyond their symbols and types, or the natural world. The aim of the experience within the sacred space was to magnify the enigmatic nature of actualized existence, saturating the sacred with heavy ornament, dense color hues, and proximate figures that purposefully mystify the divine truth. In the deepest recesses of Uzumlu-Kilise, where I conclude my talk, the exterior landscape obtains its most cosmological exteriorized rendition. Enshrouded in a wine-red Maphorian, guarded by archangels, floating in a concave field of shimmering peacock feathers above chains of gold, the Theotokos reigns over the pseudo-domed sanctuary, an abstract structure imitating the divine sphere. Layers of concentric circles and twinkling crosses amplify the matrix of the rough-hewn rock. Wherein the natural rock structure transmorphs into a fantastical domical sanctuary, the Theotokos is now rendered in explicitly figurative form. Proximity to mystery allows a new closeness to visibility, where the image no longer needs to be imagined as the fruiting ornament of the nave and vestibule. The center of the conical rock formation acts as its inverse, where access to the heavenly realm and form is realized within the farthest core of the earth through yet another structure impossible to create by masonry, but achievable here through the allowances of the very physical nature of the rock. Uzumlu-Kilise is one of many rock-carved churches largely unprotected from the living elements, but maybe it was never meant to be from its very conception. The church's abstract and hyperbolic forms offer a version of space that is deeply implicated in accepting the ever-shifting, ever-invisible, ever-unknown mysteries of nature and forms themselves. Once more, as Karen Barad stresses, the physical world, and this includes the forms used to mitigate it, have proven to us that, quote, we are a part of that nature that we seek to understand. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ariana Pemberton. Ariana is a PhD candidate in the History of Art department at UC Berkeley. Her dissertation focuses on the global medieval world with a specific focus on South Asia and the Indian Ocean. And her talk today draws from her doctoral thesis on South Asian ivory. Drawing on her interdisciplinary training in art history and technical training in photogrammetry, PMF analysis, as well as her language training in Hindi, Urdu, Sanskrit, and Arabic, her dissertation brings together global art history and eco-art history to offer a philosophical and art historical mediation on human, non-human encounters in the medieval world. But this only constitutes one aspect of the many projects she's currently working on. Her other ongoing research projects include the 15th century architecture patronized by the first black ruler of South Asia, the Habshi ruler of South Asia. Today, however, she will draw on her doctoral dissertation, which she has presented widely, including the Association for Asian Studies, as well as upcoming conferences such as SIHA and at the Royal Ontario Museum. Ariana.
Thank you, Sugata, and thank you so much to the organizers of this conference and to the director of the Getty. I'm so happy and honored to be here. I will jump right in. In a sculptural frieze from the 13th century Konark Sun Temple in southeastern India, marked with a star on the map, the temple's patron, Narasimhadeva, ruler of the Ganga dynasty of Kalinga, Utkala, and Kosala, regions that today comprise the Indian state of Odisha, is depicted on a carved ivory throne, adorned with mythical hybrid lion-elephant creatures, Gajasimha. Taking the representation of the ruler seated on his ivory throne as a starting point, my talk examines the ways in which Narasimhadeva employed the ecological value and the talismanic efficacy of elephant ivory to amplify and extend his political and spiritual power over both human and non-human worlds. Two extant legs from Narasimhadeva's throne, now in the collections of the Freer Gallery and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, will be the principal objects of my analysis in this talk. The first part of my talk will show how thrones in South Asia were both analogous to a divine seat or a sacred altar, and, through ritual invocation, the physical residence of a presiding deity. In other words, a ruler once consecrated while seated, indeed enshrined on a throne, was akin to a god. The throne, with immanent power inherent to its very material, was consequently recognized as an essential king-making device. Focusing on the material of Narasimhadeva's throne, I will then discuss the physical and symbolic resonances of ivory, sourced from elephants, and the ways in which the throne imparted onto the ruler a more than human power to articulate a kingship that was not only cosmopolitan in nature, but also endowed with elephantine potency. Let me begin with the iconography of the throne legs to illustrate its cosmological significance. Carved out of ivory, the legs depict a magnificent Gajasimha, a guardian creature with an elephant's head and a lion's body. Already, the potent combination of elephants, animals with celestial origins, and lions, representing solar power, reveals the throne's powerful symbolism. Furthermore, the Gajasimha straddles a vast mountain that incorporates a thriving ecology of diverse animal and plant species, including monkeys, parrots, bulls, and mango trees. But even as it is teeming with life, the mountain is made subordinate to the hybrid lion-elephant, whose claws grasp over entire layers of the carved mountain's crags. The Gajasimha dominates, indeed, has complete control over the mountainous ecosystem from which the throne emerges. In short, the Gajasimha controls the earth, represented here as a forested mountain teeming with life, mirroring the position of the enthroned king. Over millennia, the throne in South Asia has served a cosmological and divine function. According to scholars such as Janine Abouye, thrones originated as altars for nature spirits and marked a lieu sacré, or sacred place. Given the ephemerality of building materials for these early altars, few, such as this stone altar constructed in the 3rd century BCE at the holy site of the Buddha's enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, exist today. The subsequent appropriation of altar-like seats, such as the throne, led to enthroned kings being seen as enshrined gods. A verse from the 2nd millennium BCE Rig Veda reiterates that an enthroned king was, and I quote the Rig Veda here, the pivot of the universe, the very road along which the blessings of heaven reached the earth. Larger than life-size sculptures of enthroned Kushan kings from the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, as well as the image of the enthroned Buddha, signals towards this long history of the intimate entanglements between royalty and divinity through the use of thrones. Even as late as the 11th century, closer to the time when Narasimhadeva patronized his magisterial ivory throne, we find textual evidence that it was the throne and not the figure of the king that shaped the idea of divine kingship. For instance, the Simhasana Dvatrimshika, or 32 Tales of the Throne, narrates stories about the affective and benevolent acts of King Vikramaditya's throne. And in another frieze from the 13th century Konark temple, we see Narasimhadeva paying homage to the gods Jagannatha and Durga, seated on a Gajasimha throne that resembles the ruler's own throne, illustrating the continuity in the conflation between enthroned kings and enshrined gods. The two friezes from the same temple, one depicting the king seated on a throne and the other illustrating enshrined gods, emphasize the throne's efficacious function. Thrones functioned as physical residences of a presiding deity. Through ritual invocations that invited a deity into a material object, the throne could be transformed into a divine receptacle. Following this transformation, kings would make offerings to the throne before sitting upon it in order to physically absorb the potent power of the throne imparted by the deity in residence. Even after one's coronation, monarchs were expected to pay respect to the divine throne as a way to demonstrate their subservience to the powers alive within the material, in this case, ivory. Along with specific types of fragrant woods and expensive metals, ivory was, according to medieval South Asian treatises on art and architecture, a praised material with which to construct thrones. A pair of ivory-carved throne legs from Bagram in Afghanistan and dating to the 4th century helps illustrate the longer history of using ivory for thrones. While there are a few extant examples of ivory thrones from the ancient and medieval periods, texts such as the Mahabharata and the Chulavamsha corroborate the prevalence of the use of ivory to construct thrones. One cannot, however, speak of ivory without considering the role of the elephant. And in South Asia, elephants have figured prominently in political, cultural, and religious histories for millennia. They were employed in armies. They carried kings and relics. They have been represented as vehicles or vahanas for gods, such as Indra, the king of gods in the Vedic pantheon, and in elephant hybrid forms worshipped as Ganesha. Given this rich symbolic, religious, and cultural history, it is no surprise that elephants were under strict legal protection since at least the 2nd century BCE. In the Arthashastra, a seminal 2nd century BCE Sanskrit treatise on governance, the ownership, control, and maintenance of elephants is repeatedly described as an essential part of the king's duties. To ensure that healthy adult elephants were available for royal armies, the text instructs kings to implement numerous policies to protect wild elephant populations in forests, or gajavanas. These forest management policies outlined in the Arthashastra seem to have retained their importance even in later centuries in Odisha. 5th and 6th century copper plates from the region, for instance, mention royally appointed hastyadhyakshas, chief superintendents of elephants. Much more can be said about the significance of elephants and elephant management in pre-modern South Asia. But for the sake of time, I turn to the specific material and materiality of ivory used in Narasimhadeva's throne. As products of elephants, rhinoceri, or bulls, tusks and horns, shringas in Sanskrit, were symbols of strength, power, and might. The talismanic efficacy of ivory was thus affective in a way such that the vigor or luster of an elephant could be imparted onto one who came in contact with the material. This is confirmed in a line from the 2nd century BCE text, the Kaushika Sutra, shown in this slide, describing the use of ivory as a wearable talisman. For a moment, recall the ivory legs from Bagram. Note the way in which these throne legs distinctly retain the natural shape of the elephant's tusk. The shape of the tusk is key in understanding the symbolic and formal relationship between ivory and the cornucopia, or horn of plenty. In Sanskrit, the Nidhi Shringha, which literally means treasure tusk. One can see from sculptural evidence that the elephant's tusk was closely associated with abundance, wealth, prosperity, and fertility. At sites such as Bharhut and Sanchi, for instance, elephant tusks sprout lotus rhizomes, jewelry, bunches of grapes, and mangoes. Medical treatises further confirm that coming into contact or even seeing ivory was auspicious for one's health and prosperity. No doubt, Narasimhadeva would have been affected by the talismanic effects of his ivory throne. In this sense, the ivory throne acted as a type of mechanism that transformed the body of the king. Seated on his ivory throne, Narasimhadeva was no longer just a man. The throne made him king, and thus endowed him with a divine power. The material of the throne transmitted auspicious elephantine potency to Narasimhadeva that was otherwise inaccessible to humans. But you might be wondering at this point, how does the global fit into this narrative of potent ivory thrones? Elephants are critically endangered in South Asia now due to the loss of habitat and large-scale hunting from the colonial period onwards. But given the abundance of elephants in medieval South Asian art historians often assumed that ivory sculpture from the subcontinent was carved using locally sourced material. While peptide mass fingerprinting, or PMF, examinations that I have performed on a number of South Asian ivory objects have confirmed that Asian elephant ivory was indeed utilized to a great extent, my research on Narasimhadeva's throne legs has led me to conclude that, in this case, the ivory was from an African elephant. At the very least, the throne I propose complicates our understanding of the globality of medieval South Asian material culture. My determination of the material's African provenance is based firstly on the size of the throne legs. The freer leg is 35 centimeters long and 14.5 centimeters in diameter, and the Philadelphia leg is 34 centimeters tall with a 13-centimeter diameter. The maximum diameter for Asian elephant ivory, however, is only 11 centimeters. That African elephant ivory was used for sculpture during the reign of Narasimhadeva is further corroborated by PMF examinations that I have conducted on other ivory objects, also from 13th century Odisha. My analysis of this sculpture from the MFA Boston revealed a concentration of peptides with mass weights of 1,540.7, which is characteristic only of African elephants. And I would like to thank Dr. Daniel Kirby at Northwestern University for helping me conduct these analyses, and Laura Weinstein and Sonia Raimes for granting me permission to test sculptures in the collections of the MFA Boston and Cleveland Museum of Art. It should not surprise us that Narasimhadeva had access to African elephant ivory in the 13th century. From at least the 1st century CE onward into the 2nd millennium, Odisha had been known to export both ivory and elephants to regions as distant as the Mediterranean. We know this from written accounts, such as the 1st century CE periplus of the Erythraean Sea, and as we can see in this map, showing trade routes described in the periplus, Odisha, then known as Dosaran, was well connected via Indian Ocean trade routes. Even in the 12th century, visual evidence, such as this model of a ship transporting an elephant, and you can see the elephant is right there, shows the continuity of this trade. However, the rise of Abbasid maritime mercantilism in the 9th and 13th centuries caused a surge in the trade of African ivory, impacting the ivory monopoly that Odisha held in earlier periods. Nevertheless, ivory remained a valuable commodity in Odisha, regardless of whether it came from an Asian or African elephant. On the one hand, African ivory was perhaps preferred over Asian ivory due to its larger size and higher density. One gets a sense of the difference in size from these two early 20th century photographs taken in Africa and India, respectively. African ivory would have allowed for the carving of a larger sculpture with finer detail. On the other hand, I propose that the ruler's access to a valuable resource such as African ivory provided the court with a sense of cosmopolitanism. Citing Dr. Nancy Oom's seminal scholarship on architecture from Mocha as a quintessential model of pre-modern cosmopolitanism, Sanjay Subramaniam, in his recent book, Across the Green Sea, has developed the idea of port cities as sites where global aesthetic traditions became localized. Sandy Preeta Meyer, in her scholarship on Swahili coast architecture, too, has highlighted the transcultural nature of pre-modern Indian Ocean world local efforts to, quote, domesticate the foreign and the global. This idea of cosmopolitanism as a way to localize the global would have undoubtedly been important to rulers such as Narasimhadeva. As the Odishan monopoly over maritime ivory trade dissolved by the 9th century, it would make sense that Narasimhadeva, now, to put it colloquially, a smaller fish in a bigger pond, largely under Abbasid control, would have wanted to emphasize his global maritime commercial activity across the Indian Ocean world for local audiences such as courtiers and visitors to the royal court. But it was not just that the African ivory throne legs illustrated Narasimhadeva's access to materials via oceanic trade. I propose that the ruler's use and display of African ivory demonstrated his control over both local and global ecologies. Narasimhadeva articulated his imperial authority by using a material that was at once recognizable in both Odisha and across the Indian Ocean. With the recent ecological turn in art history, scholarship, for the most part, has focused on the legacies of post-1500 ecological imperialism and natural resource extraction. Consequently, the complex and mutually affective relationships between humans and non-humans have been understudied by art historians, especially in the context of pre-modern South Asia, where the lives of humans and elephants have been inextricably linked for millennia. By way of addressing this lacuna, I want to bring into focus the entanglements between historical actors, both human and non-human, and non-living material. Ivory, or mineralized collagen, purportedly inanimate, was seen as talismanic, and the throne made of this potent material was an affective instrument or machine that endowed those who came into contact with it with elephantine power. A consideration of both transregional circulations across the Indian Ocean and the relationship between humans and the natural environment that shaped pre-colonial understandings of ivory introduces new perspectives on the concept of connectivity that emphasizes the agentive forces of the matter, materiality, or material and materiality of Narasimhadeva's throne. On the one hand, the ivory legs of the throne highlight the urgency of taking seriously the affective forces of matter in pre-colonial worlds. Let us return to the sculptural frieze of Konark. Here, Narasimhadeva sits not on a throne, but on an elephant. It is no surprise that Narasimhadeva adopted the epithet Gajapati, which can be translated as Lord of the Elephants. Sourcing ivory from an African elephant for his royal throne was perhaps one way of actualizing this epithet. Narasimhadeva was not only the lord of his own elephants, but the lord of elephants from East Africa as well. On the other hand, the throne On the other hand, the throne allows us to comprehend the rich and symbolic and compelling history of human-elephant interactions in medieval South Asia. Narasimhadeva's epithet Gajapati can, after all, be translated to elephant lord also. A lord who was not only transformed by elephants, but even, in a post-humanist sense, part elephant. I then want to conclude by emphasizing that ivory in medieval South Asia was never just a disembodied or dead carving material. The tree of life, a symbol of the axis mundi, emerges from the interspecies union, companionship, between the king and the elephant. Narasimha, and you can see right here is the tree of life. Narasimhadeva's transformation into a king that embodied divinity and elephantine cosmological splendor was only possible through an intimate understanding of elephants, an enchanted understanding, as it were, that recognizes the physical and symbolic power of the species that was already illustrated in the subject matter of the throne. Such power, harnessed into the affective form of the throne, I argue, made the king. Okay, thank you.
Thank you to Nastasya, Maria, and Ariana for starting us off with 3 such rich and thought-provoking papers. I'd like to invite you back to the stage now, along with Nancy who will be moderating our first discussion. Nancy is Associate Director for Research and Knowledge Creation at the Getty Research Institute. Her research explores the Islamic world from the perspective of the coast, with a focus on material, visual, and built culture on the Arabian Peninsula and around the brims of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. She is the author of The Merchant Houses of Mocha, Trade and Architecture in an Indian Ocean Port, and Shipped But Not Sold, Material Culture and the Social Protocols of Trade During Yemen's Age of Coffee, in addition to studies about trade, art, diplomacy, and gift exchange around early modern Indian Ocean rim. Welcome.
All right, I think I'm on. Does it sound good? So good morning, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here for this 7th Getty Graduate Symposium. For me, this is my 2nd GGS. Now that I've attended a couple of these, I have certainly come to understand why this event constitutes one of our most important academic offerings here at the GRI. It's really wonderful to look out at this audience and see so many California colleagues convened here in this lecture hall for a symposium that not only crosses institution, but also subfield. And indeed, we have many convenings here at the GRI and at the Getty, but we rarely have the opportunity to so broadly intersect across areas of interest. And I'm really gratified that we have come together today to focus on this rising generation of art historians, turning our attention to work that is still being shaped, some of which emerged in seminars for papers, or is being prepared to become parts of dissertations in progress. But ultimately, so many of the ideas that we have heard and will continue to hear are destined to find their way into future books, articles, and other ambitious projects. And it's really exciting, I think, for all of us to be aligned in this collective interest of mentorship, whether it be toward those who we advise and teach, or to those that we consider to be our peers. And I feel really lucky this morning to have the opportunity to respond to very briefly and moderate this first panel of papers, all of which are oriented around the built and material environment of the ancient and medieval world. They covered a lot of ground, probing into the lives of Rome's most forgotten inhabitants and underground spaces, and by looking into a mysterious, ornamented spiritual space in Anatolia, and by tracing meaning across maritime trajectories of sumptuous objects of global exchange in the Indian Ocean. But I thought they came together nicely in that they all reflected a deft navigation between spaces, things, and texts, and also all really grappled with the unknown in very interesting ways, with Nastasya really using an object to get into questions of inequity in the city of Rome, and with Ariana really kind of thinking about what we know about this object that of course does not exist for us anymore. We only have two legs of it. And Maria using the unknown to leverage her interpretation. So it was a very interesting assemblage, and I think that it came together nicely. So I think I'm just going to start by asking a question of each of our speakers so that they have the opportunity to say a bit more before we turn this over to the audience. And so I'll just start with Nastasya, who I had the great pleasure of sitting next to at dinner last night. And I'll say, if anyone wants to know about the underground tunnels in Minneapolis, you should talk to Nastasya, and she can actually tell you how, really how her experience of the city that she studied in early on really inflected the work that you heard today. And I love those connections between that kind of past of your own academic trajectory and the work that we heard today. And so this cursed tablet is just absolutely fascinating. It's a tiny object, right? Yeah.
It's about the size of my palm, yeah. It's not very large.
Yeah, and it's funny to kind of see something so tiny,
I
explode.
blew it up far, far larger than you'd ever see it normally.
Yeah, and so, so when we look at a tiny object like that kind of, invites all of this rumination, you gave us a really tight interpretation of it. And I felt very convinced of where you were taking us with that interpretation. But in some ways, I kind of wanted to pull you back because, you described what's inscribed on that tablet. I could not, by my eyes, I couldn't see a single thing that you mentioned because it's a hard to read object, right? And you of course worked us through the content of that object through these diagrams where you have, everything was kind of extracted. And so I guess, in some ways, when I hear all these lovely crafted papers that are so resolved, I sometimes want to draw us back into the thing and ask you, can you take us into some of the material kinds of questions you had in working with something that is so tiny, clearly hard to read, is it from what I can see? And of course, you really brought us into the interpretational kind of intricacies of it, but I'm wondering about that thing, if you can kind of bring us into the experience of working with it, making sense of it. What were the questions you had around it? Is it, with the paleography, is it that clear cut? These kinds of, the act of engaging with a material object that is both small but rich and challenging in certain ways.
So both the curse and the benefit of working with something that was excavated in 1850 is that it's been exposed to various non-ideal storage conditions for a long time, but also it's been gone over with a fine-tooth comb by a lot of scholars before I ever got my paws or eyes anywhere near it, which means that the line drawing that I was using was made 40 years after its excavation. So when it was initially being read, interpreted, and then documented. And so consequently, the line drawing we have that I was using today is it's much more legible, and the tablet was much more legible then than it is now. So As you may have heard me say, there were 56 objects, curse tablets thought to have been part of this deposit. We only have a couple that have been interpreted or read at all, and this is the one that gets so much attention because it has been actually very well translated. If you go to the Baths of Diocletian today, at the National Museum of Rome, they are reusing the baths as a museum. You can see this tablet yourself, and it is, first of all, minuscule, and second of all, nowadays, very hard to read. I've been trying to get access to sort of see if I can poke anything else out of it, but the consensus is very stable about the text.
Interesting, and when this comes out in a dissertation, I would love to hear about your relationship then to those earlier scholars who did a lot of that work, right? Because you've got then, of course, your relationship to this object, but this relationship to what must be, what is a long historiography of engagement with it, and that seems like part of the story that I think would be really exciting to hear about, because I'm sure you want to fight with them a little bit in terms of their interpretations.
I mean, I'm mostly satisfied with the way the text is interpreted.
So no fighting?
Yeah, no.
Okay. Thank you, Nastasya. So, Maria, thank you so much for your paper. Just such a skillful interpretation, and we were, I think, really drawn into that space. I was so appreciative of your focus on ornament. I'm an Islamicist, and so I always, I really appreciate when we lean into ornament as meaning, not decoration. We really kind of think about how we give ornament a place again in terms of our interpretational commitments, right? I do want to talk to you about rock-cut architecture, and I want to know more about that. It's been many decades since I've been in Cappadocia, but I just think about the bodily experience of rock-cut architecture, right? You are out in the hot sun of the Mediterranean, and you walk into this space cut out of the living rock, and usually things go dark because you're so bright outside, and you go into this usually darker space, right? And your eyes take a moment to adjust. It's cooler, right? I mean, you feel temporally, your body moves, from the heat to the coolness. It seemed as if the Zoom le Kilise was pierced and perforated, had windows in the interior, which I'd love to hear a little bit more about. But the modulation of light is extremely important, in these structures. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that bodily experience of entering the living rock, what that means, again, in terms of the sensory aspects of this. It is my sense and my kind of inclination that your reading of, or kind of factoring in that, the sensory aspects would further some of the interpretations that you're bringing us toward. You talked about the bright ochre and things like that. Of course, that brightness, so responsive to light. I don't know if there's any artificial light that was used in that space. And so I'm just wondering if you could kind of bring us into that space, transport us there to help understand, again, how one might have experienced it and how that might intersect with your really interesting interpretation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nancy. That is a super important question. And as I mentioned briefly, the space that we can experience and that we see today is vastly different from how it would have been centuries ago, and how it's been continuously used and continuously carved and used for absolutely different needs, for cattle storage. There's also a little bit of a burial site that I didn't show you. And then the window that you mentioned is super interesting because it's difficult to tell, but I would argue that that window was pierced later. There's a little bit of a frame around the window, and on the other side, there's a similar frame with a painted cross within it. And so that could have been pierced in later to allow in light. So I would assume that it was absolutely secluded from natural light, except for that very entrance. And then, of course, I would assume that candlelight was being used inside, which would have, I think, amplified the colors and the manipulation of forms and the movement that occurs through the wall paintings. And in terms of, I just want to emphasize that that floor would have been much higher up, and we would have been 2 meters, just very slightly below those frescoes, those paintings, so that would have directly influenced the experience in that sense. But I think that something I'm also trying to emphasize here is that, yes, you're entering from this bright, sometimes hot, sometimes snowy, cold, but exposed landscape, but you're entering into the same landscape, and that it's not this difference and it's not this exact separation, but it's a coming into an exaggeration and amplification of the land.
Thank you. That's so interesting about the window being cut out, because it, I think, would have transformed the way in which that space is kind of experienced. But thank you so much, Maria. So, Ariana, thank you so much for this beautifully illustrated and beautifully delivered paper. I have so many questions for you, but ones that would just bore the rest of the people in the room. So I hope we can take some time to talk about Indian Ocean questions, maybe over lunch. So maybe I'll just put out something that I think might be a little, that I was thinking about that I think might kind of cut across more spheres of interest. I was really fascinated by this distinction you make between, a king sitting on a throne and a throne making a king, right? And that relationship obviously is at the core of the paper, and it really made me think about constructions of royalty in South Asia, and of course, as you argue, that vibrant power of the throne. But indeed, there were many attributes, right, of kingship, and there are many attributes of medieval kingship in South Asia, right? I don't know, I'm just thinking fly whisks, attendants, crowns, halos, jewels, whatever they might be. And so I'm just kind of wondering if, the throne, are you arguing the throne, is it the main piece here? Or, what is the whole assemblage of the kind of material construction of kingship in South Asia? And I just kind of want to get a bigger picture of that. And so essentially I'm asking about the relationship between things and kings in medieval India, and maybe we could just, take it a little bit farther, think about that assemblage and those other objects.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, absolutely. Other objects, spaces, architectures, things that kings kind of acquired within their kingdom all made a king. It wasn't just the throne. One of the things that I would have liked to talk about a little bit more that I only mentioned in my paper was this story, this text called Simhasana Dvatrumchika. And this is a collection of stories of narratives of King Vikramaditya's throne, and basically some of the narratives show how it was the throne itself that actually gave the king a certain benevolence. When the king was nearby or at all proximate to the throne, he was all of a sudden benevolent, had all of these qualities. That's another thing. It's like qualities of a king that made him a king. But then when he was away from the throne, he was just kind of a normal guy, not very benevolent, not very kingly. So I think that one of the things I'm hearing from your question is it wasn't just the throne as a material, which is what I've argued, but also, I guess, the qualities that the throne gave to the king, and the the vision of the king, him sitting on the throne within the court. And then on top of those things, other accoutrements like the crown or the jewels or in terms of a cosmopolitan king, maybe having porcelain in his court, or, gems from different regions or something like that. I think all of those things contributed to his status. Yeah, I hope that answers partially.
Thank you. So what do you think? Are we ready to turn this out to all of those people out there? Okay, do you have any questions for each other?
No.
We can save those for lunch, I think, since we'll be seeing more of each other, and the rest of you won't.
We've already packed the agenda for lunch, so okay, great. So now I think I'll open the floor for questions, and I would just ask that whoever asks a question, could you please introduce yourself first, just so that those here up in the front know who is speaking to them. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Richard Jung, and I had a question about the ivory legs. So there was an anthropomorphic figure that was hanging from the elephant trunks in both legs. Who is that?
So, I'm so glad you asked about that. Thank you for your question. So Stella Kramrisch, in one of her essays that discusses the Philadelphia leg, has interpreted that figure as Mada Purusha, or this kind of demon of must and intoxication. So in that sense, it's more of a cosmological interpretation where the Gaja Simha is conquering this demonic forces. Other scholars have interpreted the human or anthropomorphic figure as a tribal figure, a shabura. So it brings up questions, all sorts of questions of class and, the relationship between the king and tribespeople, and who, in this case, who has the rights to hunt the forests, right? In literature, there's all sorts of descriptions of these shaburas hunting the forests, using ivory and other kind of forest products and exploits without the king's permission. And so some interpretations have wondered if that figure is a shabura who the king, represented as the Gaja Simha, is kind of exercising his control over. But I'm still kind of working on how I want to interpret it. Thank you for that.
I'm John Welshman from University of California, San Diego. I just wanted to commend everyone. Terrific papers, more so in the context of the very difficult on-site research that some of us modernists tend to forget has to be done, which I thought you grounded and explained and rationalized extremely well in each case. I was very struck by the sort of dialectic set out, particularly in the first two papers, between the supernatural, the beyond, the transcendent, in Maria's paper, in the second paper, and the subterranean, the base, the effluvia, if you like, in Nastasya's paper, and perhaps, though I'm stretching it a bit here, the throne as a mediating place between the ground and the cosmological that Ariana was suggesting. And I wondered, in order to unpack that a little bit, and perhaps this question can be for Nastasya, I was looking at the Rossi print of the Monumentum Livii from, I think, if my dates are correct, 25 CE, a columbarium image. And I noted that some of the scholarship around that talks about sort of the opposite effects to the one that you were investigating, because here are entombed, here are preserved goldsmiths and silversmiths, and not the base metals of the pipes, but the precious metals, not the sort of hollowness of the conduit of the pipes, but the supplemental ornamentation through gilding, etc., of these precious materials. And I wonder if that just might be one form of passage into the class relationships that your paper in particular was trying to negotiate.
Yeah, I think for sure, and it tends to be the sort of the bane of studying this material, and also the interest in studying this material from this perspective, is that we have so much more information about the monumental, the expensive, the rarefied, which would have been more carefully controlled and less accessible in the time periods, in many cases, that it is being produced. So it would be actually you're right in suggesting that it would be interesting to compare the relationship to metals and the representation of metals that are more noble from our perspective to lead. But one of the curious things about this environment, and indeed about the materials that are coming out of it, is that I contend, I think the other scholars have worked on this as well, like John Hopkins more recently from NYU has published on this topic. There is very much Roman understanding of these things at points in time as equally important. So if you read first century Roman authors and their various praises of the city of Rome, you'll find evocations of Cloaca Maxima, that drain that I mentioned, and comparisons of it to the pyramids. So there's a sense in which the subterranean and the seemingly base and kind of the place that, the thing that drains the city and that you don't want to see and don't get to see unless you're in a low-income neighborhood like the Sugata, these things are conceptualized and elevated to the level of gold and silver and monument. But unlike those more precious objects which are sometimes screened away from sight in the Roman period in the context, these things are screened away from the elite but perceptible to the sort of more and more precarious inhabitants of Rome. I don't know if that answers your question in full, but there is this way in which actually the base and the effluvia are equally monumental, but the monumentality of them is actually materially perceptible only to the opposite set of people, to those who get to see the gold and the imperial chambers and so on and so forth.
It's Mary Miller again. So I've moved seats because in fact sound and vision are better back here. I want everyone in the room to just take a beat and think about where we were 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when you might have been developing these dissertation topics, and to acknowledge that you worked through a pandemic to be at this point in your work. So I just really want to honor the complexity of your graduate careers. I have a quick question that pertains to each one of you in different ways, and you don't need to answer it in order. But Nastasya, when you were saying that your tiny curse tablet, it's been around for 150 years or so. Where's it been all this time, and how has it survived so that now you can't see it? That's really, it's both fantastic and difficult. Maria, you mentioned, in fact, all the wear and tear of your building, and yet I was so moved by the pristine, graffiti-free space it is now. So how is it preserved? And then finally, Ariana, you've got 4 fantastic objects that belong to something that has been removed from its context. Could you just briefly tell us how these 4 legs end up 2 in Cleveland and 2 in New York? Thank you.
I'll start. Thank you for that question. I may have led you all astray. This is actually one of the most graffiti-covered churches in Cappadocia. And there's actually an entire body of scholarship that is centered around this church. The graffiti goes all the way back to the 10th century. And it's amazing because it's actually directly correlated. There are little figures that are directly correlated to the apostles, and there are inscriptions, and that graffiti continues on up through, unfortunately, the present day. But it is also somehow still one of the best preserved as well, and I think that speaks to the amount of pigment used on these walls, but also I would say possibly it's very distinct. This church has a very distinct nature in that it is in this one singular cone, and that it's kind of separated from any other kind of settlements around it. I can't speak directly to why it hasn't been, I guess, desecrated, or it doesn't have as extreme losses as many of the other spaces. It probably has something to do with its continual use, and I would venture to say with its heavy ornament, which doesn't necessarily need for taking off faces or kind of that kind of iconoclastic movement that's happened throughout the centuries. So, thank you.
My answer is very brief. As I mentioned earlier in discussion with Dr. This tablet is the whole cache is stored and has been stored, well, now in the National Museum of Rome, and is sometimes displayed in the Baths of Diocletian site there, but it has continuously been sort of stored in an archive since its excavation, which is why it is preserved. As I mentioned, none of the other stuff, including the columbarium that this was supposedly excavated from, by contrast, survives at all. I can't find any of the sarcophagi, the ossuaries. I have to show you other columbaria and that are comparative material because we just literally cannot even find the original location of excavation. So, museums.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Short answer is I wish I knew more than I did about how these actually we only have two. My slides were misleading. I was just showing two views of two legs. But I wish I knew the fuller histories of how they got into Philadelphia and DC. And no, you're fine. No, I was talking about other ivories from other museums too, so it got scrambled. But I mean, in more general terms, like all of these ivory objects, so many in American museums, we have provenance of the donor of the objects, but I've done a little bit of research on where that donor might have acquired them. Some records show that they got them from auction houses, but before that, the histories of acquisition are so shrouded, and probably they were illegally acquired, stolen. But the auction houses are really good at hiding this kind of record. But yeah, to answer your question is hard for me because I don't know what really happened in between when Narasimhadeva was sitting on his ivory throne, how it became dismantled and eventually found its way to the US. And I hope to maybe have more opportunity to find more information about that.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to jump in really quickly. So thank you all for your talks. My name is, oh, yeah, sorry, should I pass it on? No. Oh, I'm Sarah Beckman. I'm at UCLA. And I'm going to ask a kind of roundabout question that starts with Nastasya, but hopefully speaks to both of you because I enjoyed all your papers. So Nastasya, I appreciate your interest in the subaltern of the ancient world, as they're very difficult to sort of study and think about their practices and strategies. And because you said you liked the translation, I was drawn to the sort of, okay, we're gonna get rid of this guy's sinews and marrow and bones and then power. And I was kind of wondering, I don't know if that's dynamis or what the word is there, but then I was struck by, I think you argued that the nails are through the body and through the head. And some ways that I kind of sometimes think as a Romanist, like there's the elite and then there's the subaltern, and the power of the elite is in the head and the power of the subaltern is in their bodies, and they do all this work. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how you think these different groups understood power, or parts of, is the piercing of the head and the body explicit, or I don't know if you kind of, I'm following what I'm saying, but I'm wondering if the sort of patron who orders this cursed tablet is thinking that one thing will happen to the charioteer, and then the person who actually, or the people or the groups who carry this out are imagining the destruction happening in different ways, like kind of different epistemologies of where these different groups hold power. And along with that, so power was like through my head throughout all of these. But to Maria and Ariana, one thing I'm wondering about, and this is partly a question of ignorance, is kind of like the power of these objects, or these spaces you talked about, so the throne legs, and then also the ornament, the Theotokos, the shrine itself. Does it need to be activated in the sense of like the cursed tablet, or do we need to have the spectacle of the king on display in front of his people? Do we need to be in there like worshiping? Or does that power need to be activated, or is it inherently always in that object? Do you know what I mean? So that's my very long-winded question. Apologies.
Regarding power, yes, thank you for that wonderful question and those wonderful observations. I think it would be very fruitful to consider how the power is conceptualized and somatized by different classes differently, and that is actually something the chapter this is from explores. One thing I would be happy to add on this topic is that if you look at Roman monuments and sort of at the process of erasing people from public memory, the Natsu Memoriae, for example, that involves primarily removing the face identified with the person carved on it. So if you want to erase the memory of an emperor, you don't get rid of the whole statue, you just erase the face and carve a new one. Colossus of Nero is a good example of this. The Colossus of Constantine, actually, also another example of this. It wasn't originally Constantine. I can go on, the list is endless. But so there is a way in which defacing and putting a nail through the head might, in part, be once again interacting with the specifically Roman monumental practice of removing and abstracting people's identities and from life. And I know your question is about power, but there is a way in which temporality is also wrapped into all of this. The quote about power from the tablet, the second time the word power emerges, it's power in his prime of life. So it is a very bodily power, and it is a power that is to do with his lifespan and, of course, the labor his body can produce, but also shortening. It's a power. The curse tablet's point is to shorten and foreclose this already very imperiled career and experience. And so consequently, we have, in many other parts of this curse tablet, we have this attempt to kind of foreclose time, and as you roll up the tube, you're also creating a sort of little time loop that cuts Cordelus's life short, even as it drags him downwards and puts him in a chthonic womb, or underworldly womb, the way that, once again, whenever he's mentioned in the context of whom his mother bore, whom Fulgentia bore. So there is a displacement of his own body as something that's a product of a human body into this system where he is liquefied and frozen and dragged downwards and then put in another kind of womb. So the power of the curse and the power of his body and the piercing of those particular sites has to do with the way that the text works with the monumentality of the city overall and its language for different kinds of erasure.
I was really excited by this question. I feel like it gets really at the core of what I was trying to present in this paper, so thank you for it. For my object, the throne legs, it both was already inherent and it needed to be activated. So as a throne, it needed to be activated through ritual invocation. The deity was invited into the material, and that would only happen through a certain process, and before that it would just be kind of a, let's say that the throne was made out of wood, it would just be a chair, basically. But then as an ivory throne, there was already inherent kind of aspect, power in the material because it was talismanically linked to the power of the elephant. So I think it was both, and that's why I'm so interested in it. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I also love this question a lot, and it's something I've been grappling with, is this issue of power. And of course, all of these spaces are consecrated. There's consecration rites, and there's, in a lot of spaces, not in this one, but there's a little deposit for relics, which would have consecrated the space. There's also, uniquely in Cappadocia, a very first layer of very simple ornament in just red ochre, and that's often been considered as the kind of first consecration layer before you get to this kind of second one. However, and this leads me to more questions and answers, something that this space particularly has had me thinking about is, if the power is in the land, then how does this space function when it is not in use? And what can a sacred space continue to function when a liturgy is not being enacted? And also this question of the power of producing something, of creating something, does that cross this kind of line of divine creation, and how do you deal with that? And I think that ornament by being neither symbolic nor mimetic, it kind of allows for this interstitial space of powerful creation that doesn't go into one or the other. So thank you so much.
Okay. No worries. Yes. All right. I'm sorry, you guys just came and see these people right in front of you.
People passing around the mic. Dr. Pentcheva has been raising her hand, dedicatedly and patiently this whole time. If we could send the mic to her next, that would be great.
We can have one and then two. How about that? Does that work? Okay. Hi, I'm Siyu Shen. I'm from USC, and as a fellow doctoral student, I'm very grateful and thankful to have learned from all three of you. Today, one of my questions, maybe for the sake of time, I'll direct it towards Ariana, although it comes from something that emerged from all three of you and also some previous questions, was, for instance, in Maria's sake, you are working in an environment that still exists but has been much changed, as you mentioned, by time and environmental changes. For Nastasya, although the columbrium that you were referring to no longer exists, the tunnels and that space is still there. And Ariana, what you mentioned is the lacuna about ecological discussion in South Asia specifically. And you flashed for a second a graphic about essentially the disappearance of elephants in most of the countries there. And as kind of pre-modernists who are also dealing with locations and objects that have really been impacted by ecological change and given, current thoughts and concerns about the ecological environment, I was wondering how you negotiate or if you involve those thoughts in your scholarship. So, for instance, the graphic you flashed, I'm sure you had no time to address everything you've studied, but I wonder why you specifically included that evidence of the kind of disappearance of elephants beyond just global movement and trade.
Thank you for that question. I think that the most obvious reason for me is I think it's really important to address the imminent endangerment of elephants that we're dealing with currently when we're talking about ivory. That's something that museums have really put an effort in to kind of spotlight or highlight this issue to bring awareness to it. But in my own scholarship, I think that it becomes important because there is a rift between the pre-modern and the modern period when it comes to how humans have engaged with non-human animals. That's not to say that in the pre-modern period it was very romanticized and there was no exploitation, but just, first of all, the scale at which humans were exploiting non-human animals and natural resources, and also the way that by the modern period, by the 16th century, animals such as the elephant were seen solely as sources for ivory, as a specimen to be taken from, whereas in the pre-modern period, this is what my research hopes to show, is that yes, there was the use of ivory, yes, there was even extinction of elephants in other places, but the elephant was understood and within cultural, political, religious, and ecological milieus that humans also understood themselves a part of. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but I'd love to talk to you more about it after if you'll stay around. Yeah, thank you for that.
We have time now for what will be the last question of this first session, and so I will turn it over to you. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Bissera, professor in medieval art, and I have a question for all three of the speakers, and it is focused on the role of mercy in power. And you presented it in very diverse ways, and that's why I would like to invite you to comment on it. Nastasya had a throne/toilet that is related to evsplachnos, and it will be which means compassionate, the one with empty bowels. And the emptying of a bowels, in a sense, victory brings honor, and it also brings superiority, a sense of superiority. What is mitigating is mercy, and in a sense this throne plays a very important role of highlighting this aspect, which speaks to power that is entangled, power that actually needs the underworld to continue, in a sense, to allow for the material to move and mercy to appear. So I'm interested in how mercy is defined politically within Rome, and to think through, in a sense, this strange object that you have. And the fact also that this underworld is also very much connected to the manipulation of spirits, which is another invisible thing. It's not only the human bodies working in these spaces, but the fact that the way the curse works is to the tablet to attach to a soul that has been ripped violently, and therefore it has a desire to return back to the living. So in other words, there is a lot of power that is also vested with those who are in the guts of the city. With Maria, I'm interested in how the question of mercy is presented in terms of the staggering of images of what one sees, and the fact that the Virgin is a throne, it's a tokos, and she is a theotokos, and so she holds that power that is on her lap. And for Ariana, so I would like to ask you how crucifixion and enthronement are related, and what type of a ruler one sees. And for Ariana, I have a question about the power of the ruler of life and death, and the relationship of this figure that is in the claws of the lion/elephant, and the fact that one word could be life or death. And in other words, it is power, but it's also mercy, and the capacity of mercy, and it's transformative of what it could bring. So it's all about empty bowels, in a sense, mercy of power.
Thank you, Bissera, for that question. The space that I'm looking at definitely has a progressive narrative moving inwards, and with Mary becoming more kind of prevalent as the giver of, as the, I don't want to say necessarily conduit, but a different word isn't coming to mind right now, but as a holder of this power that passes through from the Eucharistic space in the very depth into her sitting at the throne, that then passes onto the performance of the Eucharistic liturgy in the apse, and then on the tympanum archway right there is where you have the crucifixion, and that is where Christ is speaking directly to Mary and to John and is saying, I give you the power that was vested into me to continue on. And so then that power then continues on into the vault, through the cross and through the flowering motifs and through the grapes, and then onto through the space and back onto the land, and then it circles back again. So this, I guess, to speak to the term directly, this question of mercy is continuous, the mercy of regeneration and regrowth with every single season, cycling through the space as well as outside in the agricultural land.
Thank you for this question. It brings up all sorts of things. My mind is flying everywhere with these ideas that you've brought up about life and death and mercy. So I'm going to think about this a little bit more. But right now, I think what I'll say is that it's interesting that you bring up the question of mercy, because it's something that I was thinking about when I was questioning why would the ruler want to use African ivory, you know, apart from the fact that it's bigger and it's denser and allows for finer carving, and it maybe furnishes the court with a sense of cosmopolitanism, but also there's texts there's text from the 6th century, the Brihat Samhita, for example, talks about the divination capabilities of ivory and how if ivory is at all bloody or if it, you know, if it seems to be visually associated with death, it brings a certain bad luck to a ruler when it's, you know, when it's cut for a throne. So one of the things that I haven't quite committed to, but I've been kind of thinking it through, is whether this throne, the construction for this throne, was in a weird way an act of mercy by not killing an elephant in his own forest, in the forests of Addition, instead sourcing it, you know, pre-cleaned, not bloody anymore, not having to kind of have the loss of his own elephant. But I don't know, it's still a very kind of early thought, but I'm happy to be thinking about it. Yeah, thank you.
So, you know, the connection between someone being merciful, being described as having empty bowels, is very relevant to what I'm trying to project here and propose here, rather. And so, thank you for bringing that into the conversation. First of all, to break this down somatically, right? If you have empty bowels, of course, you know, don't have anything nasty or that shouldn't be in there anymore or needs to be let out inside of you. So in the sense that you are making room for other things and making space for other things by evacuating your bowels. At least that's the first thing that comes to mind when I interpret that. Looking at Rome specifically and at it as a city and object with its own set of complex intestines and bowels and underground, there's a connection between water and its movement, and its movement in order to drain and clean the city, that once again proliferates through the way that Romans understand their city, either when they write about it or when they live in it. So for example, to go back to our example of the Cloaca Maxima, which seems to be very helpful in illustrating this, it was originally a natural stream. And unlike all other Roman drains that we see built throughout the Republican and Imperial periods, the Cloaca Maxima has a very unusual route. It kind of wends its way organically through the Roman Forum. And it does so because this stream was what needed to have the Roman Forum, which was a low-lying marshy area, drained into in order for the city to even be able to be built. And as this drainage takes place and as the city becomes built up around it, starting at this central public space, also imperial space, but importantly public space, the river becomes a culvert and then gradually becomes subsumed underground until one of the few places you still see the Cloaca Maxima flow is the low-income area behind all of these fora, separated off by a firewall so that if it burns, nothing else burns. This is the area where you still see the Cloaca flow openly and backflow whenever the Tiber River, which is this incredibly violent force that the city of Rome had to contend with until the 20th century, would flood. It would flood, backflow the Cloaca Maxima, and it would flood the Suburo first and foremost. And this was seen and interpreted often in Latin texts as a bad omen, as something unnatural, as a sign of ill things to come. And I'm bringing all this into this conversation because even the name Cloaca Maxima, it comes from cluere, meaning to cleanse, to purify. So there is a sense in which the purification of one's body to make way for the space for mercy, the removal of negative materials, is physically represented within the city, and it's what that city is built on. So of course, having a chariot throne latrine with a closed water loop under it into which one invisibly can prepare the way for mercy is definitely part of this larger understanding of what water and the underworldly association with water, which I think we're running out of time, but has an incredible legacy in Greco-Roman literature, but also specifically in Rome. I mean, the mouth of Okeanos is the last drain through which surface water can enter into the Cloaca Maxima and then exit into the Tiber in Rome. If you go to Rome, it's the Bocca della Verità. That's Okeanos, which is the river that bounds the known world and which one must cross, if you're Heracles especially, to get to the underworld. So there's very much a connection between, yes, mercy, the underworld, and water that is flowing or not flowing, or sometimes visible and invisible. So thank you.
So With that, I think we will conclude our first panel. Thanks very much to the three speakers, and we look forward to seeing you after lunch for the second panel of today's symposium.